Hi guys, Ryu here from Blender Bros. Welcome back. In this video we're gonna be talking about the interface in general, so I'm gonna tell you which areas are important and why. So first of all, looking from the top, this tiny menu here, you can change the workspaces of this main area. Now currently we are in 3D viewport space, okay, but you can change it to anything you want. Like for example, we can go to something called shader editor, which we're going to be using for texturing. Okay, I use this menu when I work in split screen. So when I'm gonna go back down here with the mouse and drag a window, and then I have two identical workspaces. So you can see here, this is all 3D viewport and 3D viewport, but I can switch here, for example, to shader editor, and I have two workspaces now. So I can, make this a bit smaller and have my model here and some other data here, like for example, nodes for texturing. So let me collapse this and let's move on. This one is really important, although we're gonna be using shortcut key to access that. So if I'm gonna press Shift A or add, it's the same menu, we can add an object to a scene. I'm gonna add a cube, and then let's just pan it here with Shift and middle mouse button, zoom it in a bit. So now here on the top I can change the mode between object and edit. The other modes as well, but we're not going to be worried about these. Now these are two major modes you're going to be working in. Okay, object mode is the one you're seeing right now. Edit mode is a mode where you can see edges, faces and vertices. And vertices are basically the points here in corners. So when I switch that to edit mode, you can see now when I zoom in, we have vertices in corners, edges and faces. And you can select them here, vertices, edges or faces. And you can click on each of them and select them, all right, with your left mouse button. So that's an edge and that's a vert, all right. I told you we can use shortcut key for this, and the shortcut key is tab. So when you press tab, you can switch between object and edit, okay? So that's edit and that's object. It's edit, object, right? And then when you press tab, you can press 1, 2, 3 for 1 vert, 2 edge, 3 faces, and then tab object mode. So this is a very quick way of switching between these modes, and that's why I never use this menu, okay? But you could access this manually here. This menu is going to be using later on, but this one I already showed you. It's actually a menu when you're going to be adding something to your scene, and the shortcut for that is Shift A. So if I press Shift A, I'm going to get the same menu as if I clicked here, okay? Shortcuts in general in Blender are very important, and you should be learning them or writing them down and memorizing them. There's not too many of them, but they're very useful, and Shift A is one of them. This menu here is quite important, especially these two options, and this is transform orientation and pivot point. Now transform orientation is quite important when you want to move, scale some objects, okay? So let's talk about moving and scaling. If I wanted to move this cube in a scene, I can just select it with my mouse, and you're gonna see this orange outline going around this cube, right? So if I click here, it's gonna be deselected. If I click on the cube, I'm gonna be selecting it, right? Now when I press G, I can move this cube freely, okay? If I press R, I can rotate it freely, okay? So R, and I can rotate it freely. If I press S for scaling, I can scale it, right? But you can see that there's a kind of like a line here and here, and that's an X-axis, that's an Y-axis, and if I click here, I can actually enable Z1 as well, okay, Z-axis, so I can see all three of them. These axes will define positioning of your model in 3D space. So when I'm going to, for example, move an object, I can move it on the Y, X, or Z. So GY, okay, X, or Z. Same with rotation, R, X, Y, Z, and scaling, S, X, Y, Z, right? This global transformation refers to the basic world orientation. So if I transform something, move it, scale it, etc., on a global axis, like global Z or global Y or global X, that's what it means. But when I rotate this cube, okay, I'll be able to transform it on the local axis. And local axis is an axis that was rotated with an object. So Z gonna be here, Y is gonna be here, and X is gonna be here, right? So I could switch it here to local. I can also access this with a shortcut key, double tapping the respective axis. So G, Z gonna be global, but another Z, and you're gonna have local. If you press G, Y, you're gonna have global, but now press Y one more time, that's local. And X, X, that's gonna be local X. So if I wanted to scale this on local Z, so this way, I press S, Z, Z, right? And I'm gonna scale it on local axis, okay? So that's important. If you want to reset rotation at any point or location, let's say we're gonna move it in here, you can press Alt R to reset rotation and Alt G to reset location, and Alt S to reset scale. Let's just turn off this axis here because we don't need the Z axis. All right, cool. So that's, you know, this menu, and this should cover the basics of orientations. I almost never use these, and this is a custom orientation about which we're going to be talking about later. Okay, it's a bit more advanced. This pivot point here is used mainly for scaling and moving, or like rotating. You can rotate around different points in 3D space. So for example, cursor would be this cursor here in the middle. That's a cursor, and you can move it by shift right clicking in a space, okay, on the canvas, or you can use the Shift S menu, okay. So Shift S, and you can move it to different areas on the 3D space, all right? So for example, we could move it to world's origin, and world's origin is in a point where all the axes meet, so Z, X, and Y, okay? If I move this object here, for example, and pressed Shift S, and I wanted to move this cursor to the cube, I would just simply click cursor to select it, and it will move to the middle of that cube. So now let's say I'm going to move this cursor back to origin. So Shift S and cursor to world's origin. And I'm going to rotate this cube around the cursor. So if I press RZ, I'm going to be rotating on the Z axis around the cursor. Okay. This dot here in the middle of the object is called origin point. Each object, okay, has an origin point. So Shift A, for example, if I'm going to add, let's say, cone, move it somewhere here, you can see that there's an origin point here too. And that's quite important because origin points are really essential for modeling. So I can switch it here to, let's say, individual origins, and now I'm going to be rotating around this point, okay? So that's basically, you know, pivot point. Mainly, I'm using cursor and individual origin, okay? These are the two main ones I'm using in 99% of cases, okay? This menu here is quite important, and not all the functions are important, but you will be using that quite a lot, especially these. Now, this menu here is quite essential. We're going to be using it sometimes. We use it already to turn on and off the Z-axis, but you could also display, for example, face orientation, which is quite important. Now, every single geometry has two sides, okay, inner side and outer side. If I press tab, so select the object, press tab, press 3 for faces, right, and select this face, I'm gonna press X and delete faces, right, you'll see the inside of that cube is red. So what it means is that this is an inner side of geo, that's an outer side of geo. Blue is good, red is bad, basically. So when you're modeling, occasionally, it may happen that geo is flipped, which means it has flipped normals. So I press Alt N, and I'm gonna simply go to this menu here and flip a face. You see now that the face is flipped. So if I, for example, want to run bevel on that, it will not work. that well, okay, because the face is flipped. So this menu here will actually show you the face orientation, right? So let's select everything, Alt N, and we're gonna flip it outside, which will flip this face back outside, okay? Go to vert mode with 1, select these two verts with Shift, we can press F to close this face, all right? And then press Tab to go back to object mode. All right, so let's turn off this menu here. So let's just turn it off. Let's continue. This one is really interesting. There's a toggle X-ray option. So when you're in edit mode, right, you cannot really see through the geometry. But when you toggle that on in edit mode, you can actually see through, which will allow you to, for example, select vertices you can't see because they sort of, you know, obscured, right? This sphere here actually stands for shading. That's a viewport shading. Let's just press Tab to go back to object mode. This one is for viewport shading. It's a basic shading when you model. This one is a look depth, so it's kind of like a render preview. And this one here is a render tab, okay? We're gonna be talking about it later. So let's go back here. And this menu is quite important too. You have different types of material that you can use for your modeling here, okay? Different kind of presets. We also have settings here like cavity. I really like using that because it allows me to see edges much more clearly. So if you look at the edges on that cube, when I turn it on, you see that these edges now pop. I really like modeling this because I can see my model much clearly. I do not use shadows because shadows actually cause performance issues regardless of your hardware at certain points, so I really avoid that. Besides, I like clean looks, so I don't use it. So that's it, guys. I mean, there's not really much more I would discuss here because we're not gonna be needing any of these in this tutorial, so let's just stick to very basic stuff. This is really important section of Blender. Think about it like folders in your computer, something that allows you to organize your scene a bit better. So let's say I have 2 cubes, okay? Let me just reset the location of this cube back here. So Alt G, and I'm going to press Shift D, okay, to duplicate, Shift D, and I'm gonna press right mouse button to cancel that. So the cube's gonna literally go back to the same location as the original cube. I'm gonna press GY to move it on Y-axis. It's gonna move it in here, okay? So now we have 2 cubes, you see, cube and cube 001. If I wanted to move this cube to a different folder, I need to select it, press M, new collection. Then I'm gonna simply type a name here. We can stick to collection 2 and click OK. And this cube gonna be removed from this collection 1 and moved to collection 2. And you can press, for example, 1 or 2 to switch between them, or Shift 1, Shift 2 to turn them on and off, okay? You can also switch them off here by clicking on one of these eyeballs. So that means visibility in viewport, that's a visibility in render. So, all right, cool. And if you want to delete that, you have to right click on a collection, and if you want to delete everything that's in that collection, right click and delete hierarchy. That's going to delete the whole thing. All right, cool. Now here, that's quite important too. Actually, that's really important. These are your render settings. So we're going to be using this in conjunction with this option here when we're going to be switching to render view. Okay, this is render view. So then we can adjust either Eevee or Cycles. There are 2 rendering engines in here. Now, if you're in Cycles, we're of course going to be using GPU compute, but we're going to talk about it later on. Right, so you can switch here between Eevee and Cycles. Cycles is more of a realistic render, and Eevee is more of like a game engine render, like a, you know, real-time sort of a rendering engine. Okay, really great for previews. These are also output settings for renders, so you can set here the size of your image, amount of frames if you're creating animation, because you can create animations, and, you know, image settings, etc. We're gonna be talking about it later on. So now watch how many icons we have here. We have only a few, right? 6 of them, right? And I'm not gonna be talking about the rest of them because they're not that important for now, okay? These 2 are the most important at the moment. But if I select an object, right, you will see that we have more icons popping out. And these are icons related to an object. And some of them are quite important. Like, for example, you're going to be using a lot of this one, which is modifiers, okay? And this one, which is materials, right? So, for example, if I wanted to add a bevel to Blender, bevel modifier, I can do that by simply going here and clicking on bevel. And this will modify my object in a way that I'm going to be seeing a bevel running through my object. Now then I can adjust some parameters. For example, I can change number of segments to make it a bit more smooth. So we can add, for example, 3 segments. And you can see that now we have kind of a bevel going on. Now in terms of modifiers, we have a lot of different modifiers, okay? A lot of them. But you're going to be mostly using 4 of them, okay? Bevel, boolean, solidification, and mirror, like 90%, guys, seriously. And of course weighted normal, so that's kind of an interesting modifier because this one usually runs on each mesh. We're going to be talking about it later. It simply fixes shading with bevels, okay, especially on boolean surfaces, so we're going to be using it a lot. And then you got something like array, you know, you got the subdivision surface, lattice, okay, here, and that's it. I mean, you know, that's literally it, okay? So 99.5% of cases, that's all you need. So I don't even know, some of them I haven't even used even once, okay? Like dynamic paint, I don't even know what it is. I don't care either because I don't need it, okay? So you don't need, like, if you're not, for example, an animator, you don't need armature, okay? Because it's for building armature on, you know, on your model to rig it. So, you know, you're not gonna be needing that, right? And there you go. So we can collapse it here. We can also apply that, which in case of bevels you should rarely do, or at least think if you really need to apply it. Or you can remove it here, pressing that X, okay? So modifiers, the nature of modifiers is that they're live, meaning if I click on this icon here, which is a visibility in viewport, I can turn off this effect. And if I click on that cube here and go to edit mode, you can see that the outline of that cube doesn't really get beveled. And the reason for that is because this bevel here is live, so the modifier is active, meaning that that bevel here is actually a fake, it's an illusion. It's not really a real geometry yet. But you can make it into real geometry if you want to by applying it. So if I apply the bevel and then click here in edit mode, I will see that bevel being applied. Now that's a real geometry, okay? So you see the problem. Control Z if you want to, you know, scroll back in time and sort of undo whatever you did. So let's remove that and move on. Now this tab here quite important because we're gonna be using mats here, which means if I click on new, I'm gonna be automatically adding material to selected object. You cannot see anything in the viewport because that's not a rendered view, but if I switch to look depth, I will be able to actually see that material. So now if I, for example, clicked here and started to make it darker, you will see that we're gonna have some kind of a preview going on here, right? I can, for example, make it metallic, right? Like this. I could make it more rough. So here, right? And you know, we get some interesting mud going on. This one is called BSDF mud, which is a basic Blender sort of a procedural material without any textures, just a material, okay? So, and you can remove it here from an object, so boom, right? So here, you add it and you remove it, right? Easy. Let's switch back from look depth to 3D viewport, and we can move on. Now there is one more important menu, actually 2 of them. The one on the left side is called T panel. You can collapse it or open it or collapse it with T. I never use it. I use it very rarely, okay? End panel, on the other hand, is quite important because there are a few things here happening at the same time. Now, don't worry about screencast keys. That's an add-on that actually shows you the keys so you can follow me when I'm pressing something. That's an external add-on. This doesn't come with Blender. Normally when you open Blender without an add-ons, you're gonna see item, tool, and view. Now let's talk about item here. That's quite important, right? if I move this cube, just watch location. If I move this cube, location is gonna start changing. If I rotate it, rotation is gonna start changing. If I scale it, my scale is gonna start changing. And these are really important. Now remember we talk about global and local orientation. So for example, when I rotate this object, you see, that's a local orientation. That's a local rotation. So if I press G, Z, Z, I'm gonna be moving it on local axes, okay, local Z axis. But you can actually reset these values by pressing Ctrl A and, for example, applying rotation. And you can now see that the rotation got reset, and this now is a global and local orientation of that object, meaning even if I press G, Z, Z, it will not do anything because there is no local orientation. It's been applied, okay? So here you can check whether your object, you know, is rotated, whether rotation or scale, for example, was applied. Scale is a very important subject. We're going to be talking about it later on when we're going to be modeling, okay? So at the moment, I'm just going to give you a bit of a kind of a, you know, a background story of this menu. Tool here, I wouldn't worry about it too much, and view is actually quite interesting. You can, for example, change here the way your viewport is displayed. At the moment, you're looking at your world through the 50mm lens, but you can, for example, switch it to something like, you know, I don't know, 24, and it's going to be much wider. So the distortion is going to be much wider. I would suggest not changing this here because 50mm is actually how we see the world as humans. So, you know, it's important. Now, if you're working on something really huge, okay, so let's just delete that cube, Shift A, and I'm gonna add a plane, and I'm gonna S to scale it, okay, and I'm gonna type a number. So for example, if I type S2, I'm gonna scale it by 2. I'm gonna type S100. And now if you work with something so immensely large, eventually you might, you know, scale something to a point when you can't see the object. Let's say you're working on an environment, okay? And, you know, if you think about a cube, the cube size, the default cube size is 2 by 2 meters. So that's 2 by 2 meters. So, you know, that's a lot of meters, right? And we cannot see that here. Now you can change that by changing the value here when the visibility of the world ends. So we can change it to 5 kilometers, right? And now you can actually see much further, okay? So that's where you adjust it. Now be careful with these values here, because when you adjust it too high, you might see some weird artifacts in clipping, some flickering, etc. So, you know, just be warned, and that could happen, okay? Now, this one, clip start, is actually interesting too. Let's just zoom in here. Let's add a cube, Shift A and add a cube. If you get too close to an object, you see it's going to start clipping. You can see through the mesh. So if you want to adjust or fix something really close to the mesh, and you know its mesh starts clipping, simply adjust this value here to something really low, like for example 0.001, and boom, you can zoom really closely then, you know, to this vert, right? You see what I mean? Very closely, right? And you can work on this vert. So that's an important value here to know. Let's go back to default. All right, cool. Let's press N to collapse it. Now the last thing I'm going to show you is this here on the bottom. If you right click here, okay, on this menu, you will see that you can turn on scene statistics. This will show you how many vertices you have in your scene, how many tris. We at the moment have 0 because we have nothing. If I add a cube, so Shift A, add a cube, you can see we have 12 triangles, 1 object, 6 faces, 8 verts, etc. Okay. Now you can turn it off, and you can, for example, turn on video memory. So if you turn on video memory, you will see how much of video card memory you are using currently, okay? And if you're going to be switching to stuff like look depth or, for example, render view, this video memory going to go up depending on what you have in your scene, okay? So that's an interesting, you know, interesting menu to know. And this will be it, guys, for the time being. I think that's enough to know for, you know, for starters. This menu on the top, I never use it, to be honest. I use it very rarely, maybe occasionally when I'm using, you know, I need to unwrap something for creating game assets, I'm going to be using UV editing space. You can simply click on that and Blender will switch to predefined scene that will display your model on the right hand side and UV space on the other. But you can switch back to layout. Okay, you got other stuff like, you know, sculpting, etc. So there are a lot of interesting, you know, environments here that you can work on. Okay, cool. So this should cover our basic, you know, understanding of UI and basic functions that you can perform in Blender. And in next video, we're gonna try to actually put this into practice and see how we can, you know, use all that knowledge that we've gained to manipulate with some very simple object in a Blender. In addition, we're gonna be enabling some Blender native add-ons, so add-ons that come with Blender, and they're gonna assist us in our workflow in hard surface. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.